We talk about disaster risk reduction, we talk about climate change, the increase in severe weather hazards that are affecting our communities across the country, including First Nation communities even more than it has historically, particularly because of the sedentary lifestyle that we heard the Grand Prairie Tribal Council talk about. Most of us are not nomadic. We don't simply just get out of the way like the elders talk about. I did my master's thesis actually on the effect of social inequality on the experience of a natural disaster and implications for risk communication in a First Nation community. So I looked at Roseau River, Anishinaabe First Nation, and their experience of the flood of the century, which was in 1997, that's what it was called. And quite a bit of what happened and what we saw after Hurricane Katrina in terms of social inequity was part of their experience as well. And I think it still continues today because of the nature of evacuations and the way that people with less access to resources, it's very different when you're reliant or dependent on an external body to evacuate you from New Orleans versus getting in your car. So you don't always have to pick sides. There's L-directed thinking and R-directed thinking. For so long now, though, we've been in the thrall of reductionist binary thinking. We still prize L-directed thinking. We do tend to, and I think unconsciously, and partly because this is what's rewarded in schools, that we prize L-directed thinking, rational, logical, mathematical, scientific, more highly than its counterpart. And for a long time we've viewed the other side of the brain, the R-directed thinking, is useful, but kind of secondary. So the R-directed aptitudes are sometimes dismissed. Artistry, empathy, taking the long view, pursuing the transcendent. But I would argue it's the folks who combine MIT with Juilliard who are increasingly inspired to change across all sectors. And they're what we call entrepreneurs. So they're, in social innovation theory, we call them system entrepreneurs or institutional entrepreneurs. And they carry that entrepreneurial spirit. And since I've had the opportunity to start studying business at Harvard Business School, I've started to recognize that there are, outside of my discipline, which was sociology and indigenous knowledge, I'm a young knowledge keeper with the elders back home. I've been going to ceremonies since I was a child, and I still go back and I spend time on the land. My husband and I are bundle keepers, we're helpers in the lodge, and I carry that with me. But I also recognize that I'm a translator, as it were, a bridge between two worlds, where the elders tell me, remember the spirit of everything you do. And I carry that with me, but how do I explain that to people? And that's kind of what I'm going to actually share with you as I head into this further, a model for incorporating Indigenous knowledge at an organizational level. But first I'll keep building my case here. So I would agree that it's folks who have a holistic sense of awareness that are some of our, I think, greatest leaders and some of our greatest social entrepreneurs. So I will appeal to people smarter than me to make my case. And that would be the folks I work with who have designed the curriculum. I've been on the faculty of the Northern Ontario School of Medicine for 15 years. I guest lecture there every year, and I help design their case-based learning. So CBL learning is what we use at Harvard, at our business school. And we look at cases and we look at scenarios. And so one of the things I'm going to do is present a really quick case here of different sectors that have recognized that they need to expand their way of thinking. And they're doing so by incorporating R-directed thinking into their practices. So I decided to look at medical schools. So in medical schools, they've often been, of course, the hallmark of L-directed thinking, scientific thinking, biology, separation of mind and body. And they're now seeing that R-directed thinking is critical. So I'm talking here about the medical humanities. So Columbia University's medical school teaches narrative medicine to help doctors understand patient stories better. Yale School of Medicine has students honing observation skills at the Yale Center for British Art, arguing that students have better observation skills when they study paintings. In fact, over 50 medical schools in the United States have incorporated spirituality into their coursework. UCLA Medical School established a hospital overnight program where residents stay overnight in hospital so they can empathize better with patients. Jefferson Medical School in Philadelphia created an empathy index of which they grade doctors on. They're doctors in training of how empathic they are. The Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York, which has been a leader in this trend, introduced an art appreciation course for medical students in 2003, and they've actually made it a requirement for their third-year students just 3 years later. In Canada, there's no requirement at any of our 17 medical schools to offer a prerequisite course in the medical humanities, says the president of the Association of Faculties of Medicine in Canada. But the association has urged a more diversified, flexible, and competency-based curriculum. And I know that Dalhousie, for example, has done that. I've, in my own way, tried to introduce medical humanities. When I guest lecture at NOSM, the topic is the intergenerational impacts of residential schooling, and I do that through literature and poetry when I meet with the students. Not being exploitive of the survivors. My dad was a residential school survivor. My mom went to Indian Day School. My ex-husband was a residential school survivor, and many of my extended family are as well. And so I always try to approach that very sensitively, and so I share with poems there, and there's some really wonderful literature out there that explains what that experience was like for the children who went there. Within Indigenous knowledge, we don't actually have this desire to compare and contrast and to delineate different types of thinking and to say one's inferior or superior. So this is a quote from Blackfoot Physics. I don't know if anyone's read that book. It's a wonderful book. It's by a physicist who spent time with the Lakota, the Blackfoot, and the Anishinaabe people. And he's actually making a case to his colleagues in the science community that Indigenous people do in fact have sophisticated things to offer that have been discounted by people like him. And so he's talking specifically to his colleagues in science. The Sendai framework is recognizing this need for holistic thinking as well, and to recognize what Indigenous intellectual traditions can contribute to DRR. And specifically it says that critical to the understanding of DRR is the integration of Indigenous knowledges along with scientific or technical knowledges. Specifically, Sendai states to ensure the use of traditional Indigenous and local knowledge and practices as appropriate to complement scientific policies, strategies, plans, and programs of specific sectors, with a cross-sectoral approach which would be tailored to localities and to the context. But it also calls upon integrated environmental and natural resource management approaches to be incorporated into DRR. And it further notes that Indigenous peoples, through their experience and traditional knowledge, provide an important contribution to the development and implementation of plans, mechanisms, including early warning systems. So when you look at this, you probably have an idea of what that is. Oh, hi, Trace. She's over here. So you probably have an idea of what that is. We would look at that and say, depending on our education, our background, our culture, we'd have a number of different answers. And if we say, well, you're wrong, that's probably where we get into trouble. And it's not arguing for absolute relativity, that there's nothing real, but it's recognizing where those worldviews are coming from and what they're contributing to the conversation. That's what's important. It's not to say that's wrong. So this, I had to look up because I haven't the faintest idea what causes thunder and lightning, so I looked it up. So thunder is caused by the rapid expansion of the air surrounding the path of a lightning bolt. In Akwesasne First Nation, my friends in the Haudenosaunee community near Cornwall, a number of people take responsibility to listen for the first roll of thunder every season. Electrical charges build up between two currents of air from the Gulf of Mexico that moves north to meet the colder Arctic air over Lake Ontario. Tension is felt in the atmosphere, and the first thunder is heard grumbling in the distance. As soon as it is heard, tobacco is burned in an offering, and the rest of the people are told about the return of the thunderbirds. The Lakota and the Anishinaabe, we call them thunder beings. So our Western minds probably want to sort things out. We want to arrange that knowledge in some kind of a logical fashion. We want to fit it into a category. Oh, that's spirituality. Oh, that's religion. Oh, that's folklore. Oh, that's superstition. That's supernatural. It's a natural tendency to categorize that so we can understand it. So are we actually, as an Anishinaabe, talking about birds? Do we believe that there's some type of a fire or lightning striking bird species? Are they mythic beings or are they forces of nature? Do the Mohawks, Lakota, and Ojibwe people really believe that there's thunder that brings thunder beings or thunderbirds back with them? Pretty soon the realization comes that it's not so much the questions themselves that are the problem, but the whole persistent desire to obtain knowledge through this one particular analytical route. While this approach might be the norm in Western society, it's what our schools are founded on, it doesn't really seem appropriate when dealing with Indigenous peoples. Western education predisposes us to think of knowledge in terms of factual information that can be structured and that can be passed on through books, that can be delivered in lectures and taught in program courses. Knowledge in this case is seen as an absolute. And once we recognize that absolutes are at best probabilities, because there's so many variables that can change, right? That knowledge is not an absolute that can be acquired and obtained. For certain personality types, that's going to be a challenge. And I know if you've ever done strengths finders or true colors, there's some of us who really excel and it's good. And the point is we need everybody. We need everybody. You're really good and you need a list and you need to memorize, these 5 categories. That's okay. It's when you denigrate the other categories, the people who are... I have a friend who's an interpretive dancer, and if I invited her here, during my entire presentation, she would offer you an interpretive dance of everything I'm saying. It's pretty phenomenal to see this in person. And I was not somebody who thought that I would actually watch somebody who could interpret everything in dance and offer me an interpretive dance to share information. And it's quite remarkable. And, so I think we're all, probably as human beings, we're all learning, I would think, at every point in our career. And the more open we are to new and different ways of viewing the world, I think the better for the world it is. So if you contrast that sort of school-based approach to learning, the difference between learning Indigenous knowledge and an Indigenous community is that, and the elders will tell you this, it's a transformative experience. This is how we learn in Indigenous communities. So we can't catalog it, write a book, do an online course. We can introduce things like cross-cultural awareness and things like that. But a truly transformative experience is to go sit on the mountains with Daila from Pagani First Nation and go into her territory and have her talk to you about what it was like for her growing up and what she learned and how she looks at the world, because she's looking at it very differently. The things that she's seeing when she sees a tree, it's very different for us. So for example, for me, my spirit names come from the north and the east, and I'm associated with the stars and the star people. My spirit helpers are 2 orca whales, a female orca whale from the north and a male orca whale from the south, as well as a thunderbird and a spirit helper from the west, who's a bear, that comes from a gift from the Lakota and Blackfoot people in a ceremony. So I look at the sun, for example, very differently than other cultures may look at the sun. In your culture, everybody, in addition to it being what it is scientifically. So there's an excellent book if you've ever interested in science and Indigenous knowledge. It's called Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's actually at SUNY in Syracuse, New York. And it's called Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants. And she holds a master's degree and a PhD in botany. And she says that science, Western science, is a powerful tool for engaging with the world. However, it is not a complete tool. It's not enough to learn the names of the plants. One must also hear their song. One must also hear their story. What do they like? What's in their history? What is their medicine? What are their relationships? As a scholar, a scientist, she says she had let Western science supplant her Indigenous knowledge. when she applied to grad school to study botany, she said, I want to learn about the beauty of the plants. And her advisor said, well, then go take an art course. And she said, no, I want to learn about the beauty of the plants. And she stuck it out, and now she's a professor of botany. So when we talk about Indigenous knowledge, defining it, I'm not going to define it as per what a local tribal elder would tell you they would call knowledge, but it is traditional and non-traditional. So people often think of Indigenous knowledge as traditional knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge. The point is that there's other types of knowledges. The firefighting expertise of the Grand Prairie Tribal Council is an example of that. It's not only limited to historical knowledge, there's also oral history. It's all of those knowledges, and it's the Indigenous people that you work with and you seek out, if you're seeking out to integrate this and to be open to it, who will define what's appropriate. Because some of it's not appropriate. I mean, ceremony is ceremony and it's sacred, but there are values that come out of those teachings, like balance, reciprocity, gifts, thinking about 7 generations ahead, that are gifts, I think, from these knowledge systems. So Indigenous knowledge is comprised of traditional and non-traditional, ecological and non-ecological. So it includes the full scope of knowledge systems. Traditional and non-traditional knowledge have an important contribution to make, as important as scientific and engineering. This is because the socio-economies of the Indigenous peoples around the world were based on an intimate understanding of their relationship with the natural world. However, it's only recently that our knowledge has been considered a necessary component of disaster risk reduction globally. Indigenous peoples have indeed sophisticated intellectual traditions that enabled us to navigate these landscapes for millennia. These, however, did not conform to Western theoretical constructions, and were not defined, therefore, as knowledge. And so our students are missing out. And I'm not saying that just as a general comment, but in the faculty where I am, there's very little Indigenous content, and it's my role, my call to duty to introduce Indigenous thinking to students. So I did a guest lecture Monday morning on incorporating Indigenous knowledge into environmental impact assessments for an undergraduate class. I'm doing a public lecture in December, and the professors are asking me, while we've got you here, we're going to ask you to talk to everybody and anybody you can, because the backlash or the pushback from some professors, and they come out of all kinds of different disciplines, is, well, isn't that religion? Aren't we just playing identity politics? They got slapped on the wrist by the feminist movement, and they're tired of that, and now they're going to get slapped on the wrist by the niche. So my job is to introduce them with empathic advocacy. So we saw the other day at the swearing in of our new Prime Minister, we saw the recognition of Algonquin territory. We saw the 12-year-old Theland Kiknosway from Walpole Island leading in the cabinet ministers into Rideau Hall. We saw throat singers and Métis jiggers. And we saw an Indigenous woman, Jody Wilson-Raybould, who was appointed Minister of Justice and Attorney General. So there is a change, I think, happening at different levels and scales of recognizing what Indigenous people can contribute to our, our attempts to solve really wicked problems. And government is, of course, one of those systems that and institutions that tries to address those problems together with everyone else in the country. So the strengths of Indigenous knowledge systems in DRR lie in the fact that they're designed to incorporate complexity. They expand detail, and they include rather than eliminate phenomena that cannot be explained. And I think that's one of its greatest strengths. Often, if we can't explain something, if it's not scientifically rational or bound, we dismiss it. Oh, wow, that was a kind of an odd phenomenon. We have explanations, and we don't discount it. We're not reductionist in our traditional way of thinking. In fact, we're quite holistic. I did the Strengths Finders. Anyone ever done Strengths Finder 2.0 online? A couple of people. I recommend it. I think it's $15 or $20 now. It was developed, it's a book, Strength Finder 2.0, but it's not really a personality trait. You choose between two different sentences, but they're very different. I like sporting events to I always tell the truth. And you pick the one that's the most representative of you. And there's a 1 in 34 million chance that your top 5, they have 35 themes, and these are your strengths, okay, what you bring to the table. What's interesting is that it's an approach that downplays your weaknesses. We're always told, well, what aren't you good at? Well, go improve on that. Oh, you're not good at this? Well, go take a course. It actually looks at 34 strengths, and it says, these are your top 5. This is your middle ground. And these bottom 10, don't worry too much about them because it's not really your strength. What you do, though, is you surround yourself with people who are the polar opposite. If you're really rational, surround yourself with the interpretive dancer. And I think what's interesting is that I did the Strengths Finder about 5 or 6 years ago. Then I did it again for my fellowship in the States, and I came up with 3 of the same for myself. So 3 out of 5 of the top 5 were the same, and the other 2 had just fallen down a little bit. And my number 1 strength was interconnectivity, which I thought, good. I might get kicked out of the lodge by the elders if it wasn't interconnectivity. I would hope that's what it is, because it is part of our culture. So other people, and interestingly enough, my number 1 lack of strength or my weaknesses were in the category of execution. And I think my colleagues from the Red Cross would probably say, yeah, she's good at the real theoretical stuff and writing 15-page papers about why we should do something, but how do we do it? So today I'm actually going to play up not so much on my strength, but on something else, because I'm going to give you a model here. But the difference is, anyway, when we talk about the different complementary types of thinking, and then the metaphor of the brain is good. I think starting with that, it's just different. It's not better, and hopefully you don't, look at that and think, well, there's one or another it's in you, whether you like it or not, right? It's in your hemisphere there. So the difference is when we have power over, like Western science, versus the power to. So we have, and I mentioned this in another session before, but we're looking for a recognition of power dynamics, and that's really challenging, because if you come into, a certain situation, a meeting, you may have the power. Either you've got the financial power, you're the world view that's being held up as, the yardstick for everybody else to measure against. And if you don't recognize those power dynamics, it's going to shift the conversation. So if we recognize the power to co-create, and sometimes that means engaging in activities that really do leave the titles at the door. It's different when the chief sits down with ANDC or chief sits down with Red Cross and the titles are there, because everybody has to really manage, that relationship according to, certain, I think, of course, certain ideals, but also rules and regulations. So I think the possibilities, when we recognize that power and knowledge, popping my P's, power and knowledge are both infinite resources. For a long time, we viewed them as finite resources. I held all the knowledge, right? That's what we heard. We heard that out of education institutions. We heard that out of, different experts in the field. In Blackfoot physics, Indigenous science does not seek to found its knowledge, as we do, at the level of some most ultimate elementary particular theory. Rather, it is a science of harmony and compassion, of dream and vision, of earth and cosmos, of hunting and growing, of technology and spirit, of song and dance, of color and number, of cycle and balance, of death and renewal. So, heading into the model. I talked about, in the title of this presentation, innovative pathways. So I'm going to use the metaphor now of Indigenous knowledge, which has been around for a long time, but as an innovative technology. And I'm going to start looking at industry and how corporations have dealt with innovative technologies, because they're in the same position. It's like, oh, wait a minute, we don't have any expertise in that. We don't know how to do that. People get stuck in what they call poverty traps and rigidity traps. Poverty traps are when nothing takes hold. And rigidity traps are when one thing takes hold and they just keep doing it, right? Because there's no incentive and reward to do anything different. So we're going to take a look here for a sec at a case of solar power technology and why I'm actually calling on people to become champions who create safe space for innovative technologies and innovative pathways. So from this industry, a protective space comes through the green energy movement. So the development of solar photovoltaic cells initially occurred within a protective space. They were constituted by satellite programmers in the 1960s, public research programs in material science and policies for developing renewable energy since the 1970s. The protective space widened further through international and programs for PV power systems and remote off-grid development projects. Since the 1990s, though, sustainable energy policy in some wealthier countries has opened to market niche for integrating or retrofitting solar power systems into buildings and selling this distributed generation of electricity into the grid. Some advocates indeed argue that continued trends in both technology, installation, and wider energy systems and markets will lead to grid parity for solar electricity in the future. So for example, the cost competitive against conventional electricity generation. So economies of scale. We'll be powering our car in the future by a solar panel on the roof and not need gas. And there's a car out there, it costs a fortune right now, but there's a car out there that'll run for 500 kilometers on solar energy. So I met someone recently who's working on this very technology. Donald R. Sadoway is the John F. Elliott Professor of Materials Chemistry in the Department of Materials Science and Engineering at MIT. He has a bachelor's degree in chemical metallurgy and a PhD in chemical metallurgy from the University of Toronto. After a year of postdoctoral study at MIT as a NATO fellow, he joined their faculty, and his current research is directed towards the development of rechargeable batteries for grid-level storage and environmentally sound technologies for the extraction of metals. So you know your cell phone and your touch screens are rare earth metals that are mined in China, and they're non-renewable. Okay? So he's working on alternatives to that, but he's also working on alternatives for batteries that store intermittent non-renewable energy. Because right now we can harness the wind and we can harness solar power, but we can't distribute it and store it at a grid level, is my understanding. So he was voted one of Time's 100 most influential people in the world. And for non-scientists to understand, I had to look this up. So he's working on this grid level whole of society battery storage. And what allowed this to happen is a protective space that I gave a little history of. Niches happen, and so what I'm thinking about is, in the Canadian Red Cross as an example, they approached me 5 or 6 years ago when I was at a tribal council and said, we'd like to work in Ontario, we'd like to work with First Nations, how do we do that? And then I said, well, there's a number of ways that you can do that. And they created a bit of a niche because they hired me and they made me part of their senior management team in Ontario. Then they did something more bold. A couple of years later, they said, well, can we do that at a national level? And they created another new position, which is the senior council position. It's the only position of its kind in any of the national societies in the world, so it's pretty path-breaking. And I'm part of the senior team. In fact, I report to the vice president of disaster management, who reports to the CEO or the president of the organization. And that is putting your, walking the walk, at least in terms of getting the conversation started inside the organization. So an NGO at any scale, an institution, an organization, can follow a process model for embracing Indigenous knowledge at the organizational level. They can, sorry, I'm just making sure okay. So moving Indigenous knowledge from the organization's periphery to the core is a three-pronged endeavor, one that holistically addresses how the organization thinks about Indigenous knowledge. Right? What we learn from the protective space and the niche created for solar energy is that somebody in history had to believe in it. They believed in this path-breaking innovation despite the fact there already existed a cultural significance and attachment to a specific regime, that basin of attraction. So this attachment creates selective environment through its widespread symbolic representation and appreciation. What I'm saying is that the environment, the regime, selects only certain types of ways of doing business or certain knowledge systems. So this is the medicine wheel teaching. And I'm sharing this, you've probably seen, some of you may have seen this before. This is the Anishinaabe medicine wheel. It's the 4 components of your being: mental, spiritual, physical, emotional. It's also representative of the 4 directions, the 4 medicines, the 4 great races. Our prophecy was that the 4 great races, the white, yellow, red, black, people would come together, those nations would come together and share their teachings. That happened before people were ready, and there was power dynamics that happened there. But it was supposed to be sharing, and our people knew of these races before they ever saw anybody come to our shores, because this is a very old teaching that was given to me when I was young. And for a long time, it took a while for me to understand the heart of this teaching is that we're all in it together. That's one of the teachings. That's why we say all my relations. And then for a long time, I went through periods of where I was resentful when non-Indigenous people would ask me questions, because I thought, you should know that. How come you don't know that? Recognizing now that people are often in need of conversations and safe spaces to have those conversations. And so now that's part of my work at the Red Cross. It's part of what I do in the university. I'm also the first Indigenous woman to ever be part of the IWF fellowship, so I'm breaking ground. And if you've ever been the only woman in the room at a board meeting, or if you've ever been, outnumbered in some fashion, it takes a lot of, I think, confidence and knowledge of your own history to be able to be your authentic self. And we talked about that, the young professionals, the other night. Often you find yourself saying, well, maybe I won't speak to this. So when I was at IWF in Boston last week, we had to share our history, and I shared my own medicine wheel with everybody there. And it was probably fairly unique in terms of the 35 women that were introducing themselves. And people then asked if that's something that I could continue to do over the next year, is share with the MIT professors and the Harvard professors, my colleagues at NASA. There's an FBI agent, and they've said, wow, this is great. We don't know this. We think that we could really expand what we're doing at NASA if you could teach us. And I said, I'd love to do that. So that's why I say I think rhyming, the history is rhyming. So here's the, how am I doing for time?
It is 9:48.
Okay, so I'm wrapping up. I'm going to whip through this. The slides will be available. So, but this is from business school. This is actually how an organization introduces sustainability. But I'm switching it around to say, how can an organization introduce something like Indigenous knowledge? But bringing it from the periphery, which is, okay, so you recognize Aboriginal Day. Maybe your CEO says, I'm on somebody's traditional territory. Maybe you, in theory or principle, say, we respect Indigenous peoples. This is actually taking it up to quite a different level. This is scaling deep and scaling up or down. Okay? So from periphery to core. It's a 3-pronged endeavor. One that holistically addresses how the organization thinks about IK. I'm just using IK for Indigenous knowledge. I hate doing that, but it's quicker. So it weaves IK into its identity. It weaves Indigenous knowledge into its identity. How it plans for Indigenous knowledge. How it can generates an adequate Indigenous knowledge strategy. And the action it takes to bring the Indigenous knowledge goals to life. How it configures its organizational design. It's rare but quite possible to find an organization that openly rejects inclusion and diversity in the 21st century, in 2015. But an overwhelming number of organizations, though, maintain an arm's length approach to it. In these organizations, Indigenous knowledge lingers on the periphery, virtually divorced from what the organization is at its core and what it does. And this might be because of an aversion to challenging the status quo. So this is moving into 2, just a quick note here about Now the basins are getting more equal. The regime that only looked at Western science is now incorporating holistic thinking and indigenous knowledge. And these organizations take bold steps. They're often getting caught in a web of insufficient reflection, imprecise goals, and timid actions. And I think that's what was happening at the Red Cross, that's happened at other organizations where there's ad hoc practices, there's no strategy behind it, no real recognition of what indigenous knowledge can contribute beyond it's trendy, it's the thing to do, it's out of respect, but it's actually concretely productive. The organizations who truly embrace indigenous knowledge approach the journey from 3 mutually reinforcing perspectives, and this is out of organizational theory. How they think about indigenous knowledge, how they plan for indigenous knowledge, and how they act on it. And that's identity, strategy, and design. So identity acts as the organization's highest level compass. It guides members' thinking, and it basically asks the question of what does your organization embody? If indigenous knowledge is incorporated as a central attribute of your organization's identity, the organization's understanding of indigenous knowledge as it fits into the identity must be clearly defined. And that's the key there. To actually define what indigenous knowledge means appropriately with indigenous peoples and define how that's going to enhance your organization. Okay? And this takes time. They engage in deep reflection, okay, to figure out how it fits into their core identity. The next is strategy. This is about how your organization approaches the formulating of an independent, specific indigenous knowledge strategy. If you don't have an indigenous knowledge strategy, then this is a different level. So without a coherent examination of what your organization is and what it can become, that's what a strategy will do for you, right? If you bring indigenous knowledge into the core instead of keeping it at the periphery, you'll have a formal and truly comprehensive strategy, which is something that we're working on in my work now with the Red Cross, is developing a comprehensive strategy as opposed to a few decades of kind of ad hoc figuring out what to do. Finally, this is organizational design. I have a lot more notes, but we're running out of time, so this will be on the slides if you download them. This is if you actually appoint an executive level staff member, if you have an executive level committee, you point resources to it, you design your organization, you have awards and incentives, you have training paths, you have performance measurements that are all there to support. It helps if you have board members who are champions as well. Those that incorporate indigenous knowledge purposely transform their integral processes and structures. This is actually changing your organizational structure to incorporate indigenous knowledge. And this is the model. I'll go through these quick, I won't read them out. So the process model, if you're going to engage in those, looking at your identity, looking at your strategy, and looking at your organizational design to incorporate indigenous knowledge, stage 1 is imagining. And this is from looking at case studies of hundreds of organizations that have tried to change the way that they do business and actually bring something like a new way of thinking into the core of their organization. 1 is imagining, and this is often your top manager, your CEO, a board member, somebody who says, hey, we should have an indigenous person here. We should get to know indigenous people. We should work with them. We should understand, because disasters are happening more and more and we're interacting with them. And they actually look at who the organization is right now and who it could be. And it says she faces criticism but weathers the storm. This is the role that you might find yourself in, which I find myself in, frankly, sometimes is the cult leader getting everyone else to drink the Kool-Aid. You know, how you change the world. And if you've ever seen that cartoon, it's one person shouting out and everybody else is just looking at them. Then the person keeps shouting out and then 2 more people come over. And at the end, there's just that person there, and they're all together changing the world, because that's where innovation comes from. It comes from out-of-the-box thinking. So stage 2, experimenting. This is where you actually try, and we've done this. You've probably done this in your organization when you experiment. Oh, we're going to try a course. We're going to try to hire this person. We're going to do a pilot project, and we're going to do another pilot project. So this is actually looking at adapting the organization's structure and processes to be inclusive, so indigenous knowledge. At this stage, it's still a long way from perhaps hiring a subject matter expert within your organization or having someone on staff. And you're definitely far away from having a unit that specifically does that. Stage 3 is planning. This is the new identity and experimentation have now led to a tipping point, which culminates in defining a formal Indigenous knowledge strategy. Key agents at this state of the organization are your CEO, your president, some champions on the board who set and define the organization's goals. And you essentially create a map to allocate resources towards their development, and you develop meaningful metrics to make this happen. People at this stage, when you get to that stage, if they're totally against you, they may either convert or leave the organization, thinking that you've changed the identity and you're going in the wrong direction. And we talked about this at my table recently where, people from a certain background or ideological background have joined an organization and they've brought that background to it, only to find out that the organization's identity is not compatible, right? It's not aligned. And stage 4, that's a stage, it's supposed to be stage 4. Oops. Okay, sorry. Stage 4 is consolidating. This is readying itself to walk the talk. Key agents are senior leaders. Maybe you have a new subject matter expert, top managers who are really well-versed now in the new identity and who track performance. This is the final stage. This is, I don't think there's a lot of organizations that have reached this stage in terms of Indigenous knowledge. I think some of the Indigenous organizations haven't even reached this stage because they incorporate Western viewpoints into what they do. But the stage is not an end state. This is dynamic, and this sets a permanent organizational tenet that can be recreated over time, but it's never abandoned. Once you go into, this is how we're going to work, you don't go back, and that's what's critical. And this is it. Finally, where are we going in DRR? So level 1 is only the facts, and usually how you define the facts. Level 2 incorporates different knowledge systems. Level 3 incorporates not just the system, but other aspects of intellectual knowledge. And level 4 incorporates and uses as a basis for decision-making traditional and non-traditional knowledge. And that's pretty key. That takes you beyond consultancy and the duty to consult. This takes you beyond, co-creation. This is actually having enough expertise and working with people to walk the talk. And that's to have Indigenous knowledge and those value systems complement, and together you come up with decisions. And in your theory of change model and your decision-making model, and all of that incorporates all of this. And it's difficult to get to because organizations have paradoxes. They have competing priorities, they have funders, and they have all kinds of, they have expectations, they have a brand. But this is a model, and I probably didn't do a good a job in 1 hour trying to share the model with you because each of those could be workshopped, but hopefully I did. So, and this is it. So what happens after you've done those processes and come through and arrived at that stage, that you're in the bottom, you're in time 3, which is you have a brand new basin of attraction. For anybody who's read Thomas Kuhn, it's the same kind of idea as a paradigm shift. It's a paradigm shift happened when, we discovered that the earth wasn't flat, as it were, right? That it was round. I mean, that's an example where everything we believed in is completely changed. And so that's where we're trying to get in number 3. And so my goal is to help the Canadian Red Cross and anybody else that wants to listen try to do that and learn from a whole variety of sectors and work collaboratively. So I'm a big champion of social innovation, collective impact, multi-sectoral practices working together because solving complex problems is not going to be done in isolation. And finally, my final quote, this is my auntie Josephine Mandamin, who protects water, who walks around the Great Lakes raising awareness about water. Leadership is not a position, it's a way of being. Miigwech, thank you for listening, and enjoy the rest of the conference. I don't think we have time for questions, but I'll be up here. Okay. So.